My daughter calls me old Stumpy now. I don't think it's a compliment. I rarely use notes, primarily because ever since I got my eyes fixed, they don't work so much anymore. And I can't see close up, so I can't read them. This has made my life very awkward. But I want to use some notes today because I think that the least I can do for Mr. Cameron is get it right. Let me put some context around my letter to Mr. Cameron. Many years ago, a number of years ago, after I had created my second business, a company called Visual Software, I grew it and I sold it. I sold it to a very large U.S. public corporation. And it was an interesting sale, I mean, on many levels. I'd only been a small businessman working in LA, I had a partner, and this large corporation that bought us, the way it worked was something called a pooling of interest, meaning they gave us shares in their large publicly traded corporations, and we gave them our company. And the deal had two parts. One part was that we were located in West Hollywood, and they were located in Dallas, Texas. And one part of the transaction was that we did the transaction with this sort of share exchange. And so the idea is they gave us shares, and we held onto the shares for 100 days. And at the end of 100 days, we could sell them in the open market, take our cash, and everybody would just be happy chappies. And the other side of the transaction was that because they wanted the two cultures to merge, they asked me as the CEO of the small company to move myself and my family from Los Angeles, from Hollywood, to Dallas, Texas. Now, you're obviously not an American audience. If I said that in the United States, you all would have gone, You do realize it's not 2,000 miles, right? It's also 200 years back in time. Yeah. Now, this isn't a speech about how much I hate Texas. That would take too long. But in fairness, Texas doesn't really like me either. Now, this is a speech in contrast. So I sold my company, and I moved to Texas for 6 months to merge the two businesses. And you can imagine, therefore, how upset I was on day 89 when the share price of the company that took me over had its value dropped by 99%, and I was wiped out. This put me in a very bad mood. And I did what any mature person would do. I sulked. What would you do? I was in Texas. I had bought the biggest gosh darn house you've ever seen, and it came with a big old Texas mortgage, and I had a family, and all of a sudden I had shares that I could have papered Texas with these shares. So eventually, I woke up one day, and I got angry. And I swear to God, I've never been braver in my life, and I shall never be this brave again. And what I did is I went to New York, and I rallied the institutions that had lost far more money than I had, and I took over the company that took me over. I did a hostile takeover of this company and installed myself as the president and CEO of a major U.S. software company. And then I gathered up all the executives of that company, and I fired their sorry asses. Now, I am not suggesting, this is why nobody's ever accused me of being a motivational speaker. I am not suggesting that revenge should be your motivator, right? God, after Andy, there's nothing I could say that would motivate. I don't even have slides. But what I can say is it worked for me. I still puts a smile on my face more than a decade later to think about that moment. And I do view that sale as the largest mistake I've ever made. I view the firing of its executives as the second largest mistake I've ever made. Because I now was running a major corporation, and I had no one who knew what they were doing. Which is why I feel fully qualified to give Mr. Cameron advice. So I would like to address, for the remainder of the time I have, that was kind of a cheap shot, wasn't it? I have an open letter to Mr. Cameron. So dear Mr. Cameron, I'm not talking to the audience now. I'm talking to you, wherever you are. We have a challenge. You have inherited a challenge. And the challenge that you've inherited is very much in part about the fact that we have a government, a state, which is not the government, that is living beyond its means. We thought we had a level of wealth that, as it turns out, we don't have. And we have acquired a level of debt that is, shall we say, uncomfortably large. Thus, it comes as no surprise to me, and I perfectly understand why the rhetoric, why everything I read in the newspaper is about how we must reduce the deficit. I buy it. I get it. And there is a surprising amount of consensus between the government, their little friend, the Social Democrats, and the opposition, Labor, that the deficit must come down. And in fact, if you read the newspapers, you would think that the dialectic, the discussion that we're sort of embracing, is not whether we reduce the deficit, but really how, and how much, and how fast. I was on a filming of a TV show for the BBC, actually it's airing later tonight, when I thought a very adroit Labor ex-minister said, the difference between Labor and the Conservatives is like a mortgage. If you have a debt, a mortgage for example, and you're going to pay it back over 25 years, you can pay it different amounts over different times. He said the thing about the Conservatives, about the government, is they want to pay it all back in the first year. And he says, I think that's going to harm the economy. What a fantastic comment. What a beautiful little story he's just told. But what I do find amazing about this is that that is the entire conversation. The OECD recently released a report on innovation. And they said, you know, there is a simple calculus here that you have to remember. And that is all Western nations, that's all Western nations, will only grow again if they can see increases in productivity. That means the same group of people have to achieve more and not increase the cost of doing so. And of course, if you're going to cut the size of the economy by cutting the size of government, then you're going to have to do more with less. So we need an increase in productivity as well. If there's two pillars to the growth, to the restoration of our economy, we must cut. I buy that. But as it turns out, there's this other thing we need to do. Well, where does increases in productivity come from? Do they come from working harder? No, that's not an increase in productivity. That's an increase in sweat. That's the antithesis of an increase in productivity. An increase in productivity is when you don't sweat and more happens. I'm looking for sweat-free outcomes. That's productivity increase. So where does productivity? It comes from innovation as it happens. Innovation, when it works, changes the wealth of society at no extra cost to society, and frequently a diminution in cost to society. Think about it this way. I think it's a reasonable proxy for the value of a company to look at the market capitalization of a company. It's not perfect, but if you're a public company, how much the sum of all of its shares are worth is kind of the value of the company. And if you take the sum of all the companies in an industry, then the value of the industry can be remarkably well regarded as that value. So let's say I took the value of all long-distance phone companies in 1995 and took that number. And I took the value of all those same enterprises today. And I noticed in passing that that industry had decreased in value by hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, where did all that money go? I mean, money's funny stuff, isn't it? The more there is, the more you have. And the more you have, the less it's worth. Because there's only so many things you can spend it on. Therefore, if there's more money supply, we devalue the value of money. So where did all this money go? Well, of course, something happened, didn't it? The cost of a long-distance call dropped precipitously because two Swedish guys started a rebel company called Skype. And though they can't directly be held accountable for all hundreds of billions of dollars that were wiped off the face of those companies, they were the catalyst, the agent of change, that in fact took hundreds of billions of dollars and put it somewhere. Where did it go? I'll tell you where it went. It was spread across the entire world. And all of us floated up a little bit. We pay less now to do the same thing. We are now a more connected community. That is Schumpeterian economics. That's when Schumpeter said, it's the gales of creative destruction that sweep through and change the wealth of all society. And what the OECD said, a very conservative, sober-minded organization, they said, if we want to become more wealthy, we must become more productive. If we want to be more productive, we must innovate. And tell me, what is the alchemical, magical thing that causes innovation? Is it science? Is it research? No. It's the exploitative nature of entrepreneurship. It's people sitting there by themselves saying, what can I do different? It is that funny little entrepreneurial impulse. The wealth of our country, the wealth of all Western nations, as it happens, depends upon small business. And I don't really differentiate largely between the words small business and entrepreneurs as some people do. To me, if you take the risk to go out, do something on your own, that's entrepreneurship. There are some 6 million small businesses in this country. 99% of all business in this country is small business. It is actually a well-known fact that almost all new jobs come from small businesses. Large businesses have a huge role in a dynamic economy. It's unfortunate in that they don't create many new jobs. Thus, it seems to me that if we actually want our economy to grow, and we believe that it's going to come from the growth of productivity, which comes from innovation, which comes from small business, then I suggest, Mr. Cameron, you stop trying to cut your way to heaven. How as important it is that you demonstrate to the financial community that you are fiscally serious, which is important. Because the more we show that we are serious, the less they'll charge us for the money we owe. That's good. Nobody wants to be Greece this week. We couldn't even sell our islands. That was a joke. So I would like to recommend a few change in priorities. I do not think that the public dialogue can merely be about cuts. Oh, it is going to be about cuts. We are going to enter an autumn of discontent, are we not? The political parties are about to have all that, their conclaves. Sometime in October, we're going to announce something like a budget, but smaller. And I feel very bad. But dude, you volunteered for the job. And you have broad shoulders. So here's the things I would like to suggest we change. Number one, we must increase economic freedom. It's not a term you hear very often. Economic freedom is the flexibility of a company to start and to grow. Second, I want government to hold itself responsible for the complexity it creates in my life. Enough of shifting the burden to me. I like Andy's example about First Direct, because First Direct has actually got two elements to it. He spoke quite correctly about one of them, and that is their fantastic service. But they have quite adroitly also shifted a good portion of the responsibility to the consumer by using the web as the interface, thus making self-service a virtue. You can't palm that one off on me, Cameron. If you create a law, ask yourself, what impact does that law have on me? Does it increase the complexity? Because if you treat all businesses alike, you treat small business unfairly. If you give one employee an absolute right, a company of 10,000, that one employee, they are now 9,999. If you're 20% of your workforce. An equal application of something has an unequal impact. And we have to be very, very clear. Economic freedom says that you, the government, owe the responsibility of asking yourself, what are the consequences of the complexity that we create? 3, there is a bit of a myth about starting businesses. Now, I'd be the first to admit, I've started a lot of businesses. Some have been successful, and some, which I rarely talk about, have been less than successful. I like to think of them as my others. One thing I know the path that companies take to get money. And if you ever ask any small business what their challenges are, they will tell you, my number one challenge is I need to increase revenue, because all small businesses think that heaven lies in the next sale. That's fine. It's a myth, but it's a good one. And the other one is they're short of capital, and that the banks aren't lending. Well, that's true. The banks aren't lending. I buy that. But I got news for you, businesses. Capital's not the question. More so, even when it is the question, we have a series of myths, Mr. Cameron, that you think capital comes from things like venture capitalists. There are in this country some 1,500, 2,000 maybe at the top venture capital funded businesses. We have 6 million small businesses in this country. The largest study of business growth that ever happened, that took a look at companies that had become very, very large in the US and then worked backwards to see what had been indicia of success from when they were young. What did they have in common when they were small? Found out that none of them had taken venture capital. Now, that's not necessarily a positive indicator. It doesn't mean the taking of venture capital means you will fail. It just means that the absence of venture capital had not been something that had barred them from success. Now, there are some other peculiar findings from that report. But it is a fraction of businesses that take risk capital from high-risk entities like venture capitalists. Our future as an economy does not depend on the minuscule venture capital industry that we have. Well, let's move upstream. If the money's not coming from them, where is it coming from? Well, a lot of people say, well, it comes from angel investors. Well, I'm an angel investor. It's a great term, angel investor. It makes it sound lovely, doesn't it? You know, it doesn't come from the fact that we're angelic. It comes from the fact that nobody else has wings broad enough to fly into the thin air of risk, where you have to be pretty damn stupid to invest. Angel investment, in theory, is the high-risk end of investment. What angel investment is the initial point for third-party investment. Because before angel investment is where the real money is. The vast bulk of capital that is invested into small businesses comes from families and friends. This is simple economic truth. In all Western nations, and in fact most nations, the vast bulk of money, if you take the total sum of capital invested in companies, and you look where it came from family and friends. Why? Well, because when you start a business, only your friends, your families, or an utter fool would invest in you. Nobody rational would. I certainly don't. Well, I do, but that's why I'm an angel investor. The fact of the matter is, the money, this country is not broke. We are privileged. We are one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Give me a break. We all know that. So where is the money? The money is locked up in all of our accounts. I know all of you think, not in my account. Okay, fair enough. But there are more people with a bit of money put away than people without a bit of money put away. And here's what I propose, David. We're on first name basis now. You can call me Doug. David, I suggest the following. I suggest the last thing we do is let you collect the money to redistribute it. Because it's been my experience that if I send £1 to you, I get about a pence back. There's some inefficiency going on there that I'd like you to look at some other time. But right now, I would suggest that we look at the fact that people have savings and people have friends and family, and we say, let's top slice it. Let's say to every person in this country, you have a right, tax-free, to take a certain amount of money every year and put it into a startup or a small business. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could be 5,000 quid, 10,000 quid, 50,000 quid. Most businesses don't start on much more. I personally am an advocate that even high-tech businesses shouldn't start on much more. Most of what I teach is about how you should start a business without capital. Capital has never been my friend. Every time that capital gets involved, I get grumpy. They just boss me around like they know what they're doing. Completely different speech. So David, section 2. After economic freedom, let's free up the savings of people so they can do what they would do anyways, invest in their families and friends. Moving on. We pay people to be unemployed. It is a simple truth. It's welfare, it's benefits. There's nothing wrong with that. We are a civil society. I am socially a very liberal person. I want us to have a rich society so I can enjoy the benefits of living in a civil society. But if we're going to pay them to be unemployed, wouldn't it make some sense to pay them to be employed? And this is not just directed at you, David. I want you to convene all the business owners around you, and I'll speak to all of you at once. Shame on you. Why do you not have apprentices? And by the way, I do love the fact that in the UK, apprentice means working class and intern means middle class. That's just the coolest thing. Okay, so in my world, intern, apprentice, it's somebody who doesn't know what they're doing that you've employed anyways, right? That's the definition. And the quid pro quo is, eventually they will know what they're doing, and they will return to you a certain period of work at less than their market value in return for having learned in the first place. That was the notion of an apprenticeship. It's a very old notion. You know what else? It's a very modern notion. An apprenticeship is not just for plumbers. An apprenticeship is for web designers. An apprenticeship is for VPs of marketing. An apprenticeship is for anybody who's not yet qualified for a job. And what pisses me off, I've had apprentices and interns in every company I've ever started. We have about 1 million kids coming out of high school and out of universities in this country, and they are all looking straight into the face of unemployment. We have over 6 million businesses. Someone tell me that we can't afford, that those businesses, that a great bulk of those businesses couldn't reach out and pick up one apprentice. For goodness sakes, minimum wage is £800 a month. I don't buy it. Full stop. And if we're going to pay for them to be unemployed, why don't we just share the burden? If the businesses are going to be so bloody cheap they can't shoulder the 800 quid a month themselves, why don't you do that? Let's pay them to work. Because then they won't be incompetent forever, will they? David, I'm not done. My list is much longer. But I'm not going to spend the whole day here. So I'm going to only put 2 more things down on a table for today, because I want to stick to the important stuff. Governments are many things. But first and foremost, they're the largest customer in the country. Nobody else spends as much money as a government, and most of the money it spends on buying stuff. So has it occurred to you you might spend some on small businesses? Why do you continue to buy only from the large? And don't tell me it's a voluntary system or it's difficult. It's been done in other countries. We don't always have to have our plugs be different than everyone else. We can do what other people have done. We can do what other people have done. It doesn't have to be invented here. Other countries have mandated that the government spend a certain percentage of total money spent on small businesses, and it has transformed the growth of small business in those countries. David, you got a free one here, because however much you spend, you're still spending the same amount. You're just directing the fire hose slightly different. And lastly, it seems to me, just a personal opinion, I mind you, that if I can rent a 1-bedroom flat in Seoul, Korea, and for $20 a month, get 20 times the broadband speed today than that which you have promised Britain by 2015, there's something wrong. I don't want to wait to 2015 to get what they had in 1995. Moreover, if you take seriously the notion, as I do, that Britain's future rests as much on our capacity to innovate as anything else, then I got news for you. It ain't trains. This isn't Victorian era, and it ain't highways. It's broadband. And by the way, 2 megabits a second is not broadband. That's piss trickle band. A gigabit a second, now that's broadband. We can change society. We can reinvigorate parts of the country to which it's difficult to get. We can move less stuff around. We can be less impacted when the tube goes on strike. Not that I'm suggesting it pissed me off, David. That's my letter to Boris. I'll come back to that. But what I can say is this. Our infrastructure for the 21st century is going to depend on our connectivity. In the competition between nations, our level of connectivity will determine whether or not we are positioned and capable of prospering. Our entrepreneurs and our businesses, our commerce, our welfare, the quality of our healthcare, the quality of our safety, the quality of our roads, and our lives depends upon it. So get serious. 2 megabits a second is not a promise. That's a failure. Let me close with the following thought. It is important to live in a civil society. A civil society does not mean a government that takes care of us from cradle to grave. I would assert that an overprotective state has an invidious and corrosive effect. The more the state takes care of, the less we have responsibility for. And the pernicious impact of that loss of responsibility is the loss of capacity to know that we can make change. In a society where we owe no responsibility and we have no responsibility to do anything, we don't know that we can do anything. Thus, I would assert that the question is not whether we have a civil society, but whether we share the responsibility of having a civil society. Yours truly, Doug.